At precisely 10:17 a.m., the laughter of Sterling Corp's executives died in their throats when the old black janitor they'd mocked for decades opened his briefcase and revealed he owned the company they thought was theirs. The building was always silent at 5:30 a.m., a silence so deep that even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum more softly. Otis Carter preferred it that way. The absence of hurried footsteps, of clipped voices echoing through polished corridors, gave him space to move at his own rhythm. At 68, his knees no longer bent as easily, but his stride remained steady, practiced, almost ritualistic. The mop in his hands was no longer just a tool, but an extension of his body, a partner in the dance he had repeated for decades. The janitor's cart rolled ahead of him, wheels squeaking faintly on marble floors, its compartments neatly arranged with sprays, rags, and polish. His hands, dark and roughened by time, bore the texture of calluses carved by years of labor. Once those same hands had assembled intricate prototypes in college labs, shaping the dreams of a young engineer at Howard University. Back then, his professors had praised his precision, his imagination. Back then, he had believed he would be building bridges, designing engines, inventing things that lasted, but the doors of industry had stayed shut, slammed closed not because he lacked brilliance, but because he was a black man in an era where talent was weighed differently depending on the color of the hand that offered it. What had been temporary, this janitor's job, had stretched into a lifetime. He paused by the tall glass walls outside the executive suites. The skyline shimmered faintly in the distance, touched by the first pale hints of dawn. For a moment he let himself look at it, the city alive with promise, and then he turned back to his work. Precision guided him even here, his P strokes were clean lines, his polishing strokes deliberate, controlled, nothing out of place, nothing wasted. By the time the first elevator chimed, Otis had already finished 3 floors. He wheeled his cart toward the 3rd floor closet, the one that doubled as his sanctuary. The closet smelled faintly of bleach, pine, and old paper. Inside, he kept a folding stool and a battered lunch bag. He would sit on the stool during his half-hour break, unwrapping a sandwich with careful hands, sipping coffee from a dented thermos. It was not a cafeteria, not a proper lunchroom, but it was quiet. It was his. Most days, no one noticed him at all. When they did, it was rarely kindness. Patricia Wilson from HR once wrinkled her nose as she told him to stop eating in the closet, claiming executives have commented about the smell. The cafeteria had been an option long ago, until Ryan Sterling, the new CEO, son of the founder, had quipped loudly across the tables that the help should keep separate from the talent. The laughter that had followed still rang in Otis's ears, though he never let his face betray the sting. Ryan carried his Harvard degree and family name like armor. He was smooth, handsome, arrogant in a way only men who never doubted their entitlement could be. To him, Otis was nothing more than Daddy's old charity case, a relic kept around out of misplaced sentiment. The younger executives mimicked his tone, trading jokes in hushed voices when Otis passed by with his mop. Shouldn't there be an age limit? One had sneered. Another chuckled that maybe Otis just liked the smell of bleach. Otis never answered back. He simply moved on, his silence mistaken for submission. But inside, something else lived, a patience forged by years of endurance, a strength that did not need to announce itself. Every insult, every dismissal, he tucked away, folding it as carefully as the rags in his cart. They thought him invisible, but invisibility has its own power. He had spent decades watching, listening, learning. The man behind the mop was far more than the world chose to see. And though no one yet knew it, though the executives mocked and the HR director scolded, the truth waited just beyond the horizon. Buried beneath years of humiliation lay a secret so powerful it would one day bring this entire glass tower to its knees. The hum of the building had shifted. By mid-morning, Sterling Corp's polished floors no longer belonged to Otis Carter. They belonged to the executives who rushed across them, clicking heels and polished shoes echoing with a confidence born from privilege. Otis had learned to blend into this current, his mop and cart moving like shadows between the tide of tailored suits. But today, something felt different. The air was sharp, alive with tension, like static before a storm. He was polishing the brass handles outside the main conference room when the first words floated through the thin seam of the door. At first, it was only the cadence of business chatter, firm voices, clipped syllables. But then, as he adjusted his rag along the gleaming surface, the meaning slipped clear through the gap. 15% of the workforce, Ryan Sterling's voice declared, dripping with authority. Lower-level staff, obviously, people who won't be missed. A chorus of murmurs followed. Otis's hands stilled against the brass. He knew that tone, had heard it countless times in the hallways, casual cruelty wrapped in business jargon. Another voice joined in, sharper, almost gleeful. Cutting the dead weight will make us leaner, and besides, who needs all those janitors anyway? Outsourcing is cheaper. Half of them could go tomorrow. Laughter trickled around the table. Otis tightened his grip on the rag until his knuckles whitened. 400 jobs, 400 lives reduced to nothing but figures on a spreadsheet. He could see them in his mind. Men and women who had worked beside him for decades, who cleaned offices at dawn, who kept machines humming, who gave more of themselves than anyone in that glass-walled room ever would. His jaw clenched, but his face remained expressionless, as it always had. The invisible man could not afford to break character, not yet. He drifted away from the conference door and wheeled his cart down the hall. His heart hammered like a warning drum. He had always endured, always swallowed the indignities. But now it wasn't just about him. He thought of Rosa, the cafeteria cashier raising 2 grandchildren alone, of Daniel, the night security guard saving for his daughter's college, of the dozens who lived paycheck to paycheck, who would be destroyed by a decision made with laughter. By the time he reached the 3rd-floor supply closet, his sanctuary, Otis's movements had lost their mechanical calm. He opened the door, stepped inside, and shut himself into the familiar smell of pine cleaner and bleach. For a moment he just stood there, breathing hard, his palms flat against the metal shelves, the weight of decades pressed against him. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the folding stool. His knees ached, but the ache was nothing compared to the fire rising in his chest. He reached for his battered leather briefcase hidden behind the crates of detergent. The latches clicked open with the sound of memory. Inside lay the truth. The papers Thomas Sterling had signed, the share certificate bearing Otis's name, the letter written in a friend's hand long ago. When the time comes, these shares will speak for you. His fingers brushed the documents, the edges worn soft with years of handling. He had read them 100 times, but today the ink felt alive, pulsing with urgency. For decades he had waited, telling himself the time wasn't right, that patience was safer, that the world wasn't ready to see him, but the world had taken enough. He closed the briefcase and rested his hands on it, the way a soldier rests on his weapon. Outside, executives plotted to gut the company. Inside, an old janitor sat in silence, holding the one thing that could shatter their empire. The mop might still be in his cart, but the next time Otis Carter walked into that boardroom, it wouldn't be to clean the floor. It would be to change everything. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the city itself. Otis Carter rose before sunrise, as he always did, moving with the discipline of habit. He washed, dressed in the same faded uniform, and packed the same leather lunch bag. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside his chest burned with a restless energy that would not quiet. The briefcase in his locker weighed on his mind like a loaded gun hidden in plain sight. When he entered the Sterling Corp building, the security guard greeted him with the usual distracted nod. Otis offered a small smile, but his eyes flicked to the elevators. He knew the executives would arrive later, striding in with their expensive coffee cups and entitled laughter. Today, though, he planned to linger where their voices carried, where secrets slipped through careless lips. He had learned long ago that people revealed their truest selves when they thought the janitor wasn't listening. By 8 o'clock, the corridors buzzed with activity. Otis had maneuvered his cart toward the executive suites, polishing plaques and mirrors with deliberate slowness. From the air vent outside to the boardroom, voices filtered down once again. He froze, cloth in hand, heart thrumming as if it already knew the words he was about to hear. "We'll need to cover the transfers before the audit," Ryan Sterling's voice snapped. "Move the funds into the shell accounts. If the board catches wind, I want plausible deniability." Walter Price, the CFO, answered in his thin, nervous tone. "Ryan, we've already pulled millions from the employee pension fund. If this continues..." Ryan cut him off with a bark of laughter. "Do you think I care? They're janitors, cafeteria workers, security guards. Replaceable. The board will thank me when I deliver another quarter of record profits." Otis's jaw locked. He gripped the rag until it twisted tight in his hands. Pensions, lives, futures, all siphoned away to feed Ryan's greed. Then came another voice, lower, calculating. Logan Matthews, Ryan's right hand. "If there's pushback, we pin it on accounting. Wilson's the perfect scapegoat. Young, eager, desperate to please. He'll fold under pressure." Otis closed his eyes. Jake Wilson. He had spoken to the boy just yesterday, the accountant with sharp eyes and a nervous smile, whispering about strange numbers on the books. Jake had been right. And now, his career hung by a thread Ryan intended to cut. The laughter inside the boardroom rolled on, each word another stone on Otis's chest. For years he had endured their mockery, their cruelty. He had swallowed insult after insult in silence, but now he saw more clearly than ever. The silence no longer protected anyone, it condemned hundreds. Later that day, he found Jake in the hallway carrying a stack of files, his hands trembling slightly under the weight. "They're planning something," Jake whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Numbers shifted again this morning, millions redirected into accounts I can't trace. I tried to tell my supervisor, but he shut me down, hard. Said I'd lose my job if I kept asking questions." Otis placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "You're not imagining things, son. They're stealing right under your nose." Jake's eyes widened. "How do you know?" Otis met his gaze, the quiet intensity of a man who had carried truth too long. "Because I've been watching. Longer than you've been alive." Before Jake could ask more, Logan Matthews appeared, his cold eyes sweeping over them like a hawk's. "Wilson, don't you have numbers to crunch? Or are you planning to transfer to the custodial team?" His sneer lingered on Otis. "And you? Bathrooms don't clean themselves." Jake flushed crimson, but Otis only nodded. "Right away, sir." His voice was calm, measured, but deep inside something broke, the last thread of patience snapping. That evening, when the building was nearly empty, Otis pushed his cart to the records room, a place few bothered to enter anymore. He slipped inside using his master key, the dim lights flickering overhead. Row upon row of metal cabinets loomed, the forgotten skeleton of Sterling Corp's history. He moved with purpose, pulling drawers, scanning labels until he found the files: executive compensation, pension accounts, off-book transactions. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages, each one confirming what he had overheard. Bonuses triple the approved amount. Pensions gutted. False board appus. Rovels forged with Ryan's signature scrawled bold across the bottom. He pulled out his old flip phone, the one no one gave a second glance, and began to photograph page after damning page. The creak of the door startled him. He snapped the folder shut, heart hammering. A flashlight beam cut through the gloom. "Mr. Carter?" The night guard, Jim, blinked in surprise. "Didn't expect to see you in here." Otis forced a steady smile. "Just doing some deep cleaning, Jim. Haven't gotten to this room in a while." Jim shrugged, uninterested, and moved on. The door shut again. Silence returned. Otis exhaled slowly, clutching the documents to his chest, before sliding them back into their folders with meticulous care. When he closed the cabinet and wheeled his cart away, he knew the truth. The time for waiting had ended. In the basement locker room, he unlocked the battered metal door that had been his for decades. The briefcase waited inside. He set it on the bench, its weight heavier now, not from the documents inside but from the decision it demanded. He looked at the uniform hanging above it, the faded blue shirt, the name tag worn thin, the fabric patched from years of labor. He had worn that uniform like armor, a disguise that let him slip unnoticed through the empire he had helped build. Now, staring at the briefcase and the truth it contained, Otis knew a different uniform awaited him, one of ownership, one of leadership. He closed the locker with a final click. The storm was no longer coming, it was here, and when he next walked into that boardroom, it would not be as a janitor, it would be as the man who held the power to bring Sterling Corp crashing down. The morning air in Sterling Corp's lobby carried an almost electric tension, the kind that hummed invisibly but made every movement sharper, every voice lower. Employees hurried past each other, clutching coffee cups, balancing laptops, whispering rumors of layoffs and restructuring. No one noticed the old man in the corner, rolling his cart with the same steady rhythm he always had. But if anyone had looked more closely at Otis Carter that morning, they might have seen the fire in his eyes, the quiet storm that had been gathering for decades. He had risen earlier than usual, long before dawn, not to polish floors but to prepare. At home, he had carefully pressed the only suit he owned, a gray wool blend bought years ago for his daughter's wedding. It hung loosely on his frame now, but it was clean, the creases sharp. He had combed his hair, trimmed his beard, and polished his shoes until they reflected light like mirrors. As he looked at his reflection in the locker room mirror before leaving, he hardly recognized himself. He no longer looked like the man who blended into corners. He looked like someone ready to be seen. By 10 o'clock a.m., the executives had filed into the boardroom upstairs. The emergency meeting had been called under Ryan Sterling's orders. Words like asset management and strategic restructuring had already leaked through the building, code for layoffs and gutting departments. Otis had heard enough of their whispers through vents and records to know what was coming. He stood outside the conference room, briefcase in hand instead of mop, his heart pounding in steady, deliberate beats. Ryan's assistant glanced up from her desk as he approached. She blinked in confusion, her eyes flicking to the suit, then back to his familiar face. "Sir, can I help you? This is a closed meeting." "They're expecting me," Otis said softly, his voice steady, before she could respond. He reached for the door and pushed it open. Inside, the boardroom fell silent at the intrusion. A dozen executives in expensive suits turned their heads, brows furrowed in confusion. Ryan Sterling, mid-sentence at the head of the mahogany table, froze. Then recognition dawned, followed swiftly by irritation. "Carter?" Ryan's voice cut like a whip. "What the hell are you doing in here, and why are you dressed like that?" The room erupted in laughter. "Is that the janitor in a suit?" One board member whispered loudly, unable to contain a snicker. "Looks like he's lost on the way to the broom closet," another added, laughter rippling again. Logan Matthews, Ryan's bulldog of a lieutenant, rose from his chair and stalked toward Otis, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood. His posture was sharp, threatening. "This is a private meeting. You need to leave before I call security." Otis stood his ground. His face betrayed none of the mockery, none of the venom behind their laughter. He walked calmly to the long table and set his briefcase down in the center. The old brass latches clicked as he opened it. "I'm afraid," Otis said, his voice quiet but carrying across the room with surprising strength. "I can't do that. Not today." The laughter faltered, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Ryan scoffed, standing from his chair, his tailored suit catching the light. "What do you think you're doing, Carter? You clean floors, you empty trash cans, you do not walk into boardrooms uninvited?" Otis looked him squarely in the eye. "I've been silent for 35 years, Mr. Sterling. I've cleaned your offices, polished your awards, emptied your garbage while you laughed at me. But today, I'm not here as your janitor." He pulled out a single document, its edges yellowed with time, but protected in plastic. The Sterling Corp logo gleamed faintly at the top, and beneath it, a signature unmistakable in its flourish, Thomas Sterling's own hand. Otis laid it flat on the polished wood. "I'm here," he continued, "as the majority shareholder of Sterling Corporation." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that bends time, stretching seconds into eternity. Eyes widened, mouths hung open. The executives who had just moments ago sneered at the old man now stared at the paper before them as if it were a ghost. Ryan recovered first. His laugh was sharp, humorless. "This is absurd. You think some piece of paper makes you more than a janitor? My father would never—" "Your father did," Otis interrupted, his voice firm. He pulled out another document, then another. Trust agreements, transfer records, notarized signatures, all carefully preserved over decades. He slid them across the table, one after another, until the polished wood gleamed beneath a mosaic of undeniable proof. Martha Donovan, one of the oldest board members, leaned forward, her glasses trembling slightly in her hands. She picked up the share certificate and studied the signature. Her breath caught audibly. This is authentic. I remember Thomas signing documents like this, the handwriting, the seal. It's real." Ryan's face turned scarlet. "This is a fraud, a stunt. He's trying to scam us." Walter Price, the CFO, had grown pale as he flipped through the documents. His hands shook. "Ryan," his voice cracked, These match our oldest records, the notations we never understood. The OT designation, it wasn't a legacy account, it was him. It was Otis." The room swelled with shocked whispers. Executives glanced uneasily at each other, at Ryan, at the janitor they had dismissed for decades. Ryan slammed his palm on the table. "Enough! He's a janitor, for God's sake, a janitor! He doesn't belong here! Call security!" But no one moved. Not even Logan, who shifted uneasily at Otis's calm, unwavering gaze. Otis placed one last item on the table, a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Thomas Sterling at the ribbon cutting of Sterling Corp's first headquarters, smiling proudly. Beside him stood Ryan, a boy then, with his father's arm around him. And on the other side, cut out of the copy that hung in Ryan's office, stood Otis Carter. The executives leaned closer, staring at the undeniable truth. "I was there when this company was born," Otis said quietly, his voice carrying a weight heavier than anger. "I gave Thomas Sterling every dollar I had when no one else believed in him. He called me his partner, his equal. For decades I stayed in the background because we both knew the world wasn't ready to see me, but I have always been here, always watching, always waiting." Ryan's voice rose in desperation, high and strained. "You're just a janitor!" Otis looked at him steadily, unflinching. "I was never just a janitor, Mr. Sterling. I was always an owner. I simply chose to clean." The silence in the boardroom cracked like glass under pressure. Every man and woman at the table knew the world outside would never be the same once this truth left these walls. The mop might have been Otis's tool for decades, but today the truth was his weapon. And in that moment, the power in Sterling Corp shifted forever. The boardroom did not return to laughter. It could not. The sound that followed Otis Carter's declaration was not humor, but the restless shifting of suits against leather chairs, the nervous cough of men and women who suddenly realized the ground beneath them was not as solid as they believed. The air itself felt charged, brittle, as though one wrong word might shatter the entire room into chaos. Ryan Sterling stood at the head of the table, his face a study in fury barely contained. His carefully cultivated calm, the smile that charmed investors, the voice that commanded shareholders, was cracking. "This is nonsense," he snapped, the veins at his temple pulsing. "You think my father gave majority control of his company to him?" His hand slashed the air in Otis's direction, dismissive, venomous. "A janitor?" Otis did not flinch. He had endured that tone for 35 years. "Not a janitor," he replied softly, though the quiet carried like thunder. "A partner. A founder, and now, the majority shareholder." Across the table, Martha Donovan adjusted her glasses again, her hands trembling as she examined the certificate once more. "The seal is real," she said finally. "I knew Thomas. He was eccentric in many ways, but he trusted his instincts. If he believed in Mr. Carter enough to give him controlling shares." Her voice trailed off, heavy with implication. Walter Price, the CFO, spoke next, his tone more hesitant. "These trust documents, they explain anomalies I've seen for years, notations that didn't align with any account. We assumed they were clerical errors or some legacy filing. But no." His voice thinned. "They were Carter's holdings all along." "Walter!" Ryan barked, his voice laced with disbelief and panic. "Are you siding with him, with the janitor who empties your trash can?" Walter paled. "I'm siding with the numbers, and the numbers don't lie." Logan Matthews, ever the loyal wolf, stepped forward with a sneer. "This is theater. You think some dusty paperwork will survive scrutiny? The courts will laugh this out before lunch. You've got nothing, old man." Otis's eyes flicked to Logan, calm, patient, deadly. He reached into his briefcase once more and slid a second stack of documents across the table. "If ownership isn't enough for you, perhaps embezzlement will be." The room seemed to stop breathing. "These," Otis continued, his voice still even, "are records I've copied from your own archives. Transfers to shell companies that don't exist. Pensions drained from men and women who gave their lives to this company. Forged board approvals with Ryan Sterling's signature scrawled at the bottom." Gasps broke out. A board member to Ryan's right muttered, "Impossible." But his hands shook as he flipped through the papers. "Lies!" Ryan thundered, his mask fully slipping now. "He's forging this. He's been plotting, waiting for his moment to—" Jake Wilson appeared at the doorway, clutching a folder, his face pale but determined. The young accountant's voice cracked as he spoke, but the truth in it was unshakable. "He's not lying. I've seen the transfers myself. Millions, hidden in accounts tied to shell corporations. I tried to report it to my supervisor, but I was shut down." He took a trembling step forward. "I brought copies." The boardroom erupted in overlapping voices. Executives rifled through papers. Some whispered furiously to one another. Some stared at Ryan with dawning horror. Others simply sat stunned, watching the invisible man at the end of the table turn into something far larger than they had ever imagined. Ryan slammed both palms onto the table. "This is treason. You're all fools if you believe this fairy tale. He's just a janitor who hates me, who's been waiting for revenge." Otis straightened, his voice cut through the chaos, calm but iron. "You keep calling me just a janitor. But let me remind you, Mr. Sterling, every board restructuring, every merger, every strategic shift your team authorized still had to pass through one notation, OT. That designation was mine, my ownership preserved every time, and you signed it without ever asking what it meant." Walter's face drained of color. "OT," he whispered. "Original trust." One by one, heads turned back to Otis, the realization crashing over them. He had not appeared suddenly out of nowhere. He had been there all along, woven into the very DNA of the company they thought they owned. Martha's voice, low but firm, broke the silence. "I move to suspend Ryan Sterling as CEO pending a full investigation." Ryan's head snapped toward her, his eyes wild. "You can't! You wouldn't—" "I second," Walter said quickly, his voice thin but resolute. Hands began to rise around the table, hesitant at first, then stronger. Each raised hand was a knife twisting deeper into Ryan's carefully constructed empire. Ryan staggered back a step, the blood draining from his face. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "You can't do this. Not to me. Not to me." Otis met his eyes, steady as a stone. "It's not what we're doing to you, Mr. Sterling. It's what you did to yourself. The greed, The arrogance, the theft. You destroyed your father's legacy long before I ever stepped into this room. The vote was cast, the decision made. Ryan Sterling, who had ruled Sterling Corp like a king, was stripped of his crown in the very room he thought untouchable. As security entered quietly, Ryan's fury turned venomous. He spat the words like a curse, his face contorted with hatred. You'll regret this, Carter. You've destroyed everything. You don't have the spine to run this company. You're still nothing but the janitor. Otis didn't blink. He looked at Ryan with the calm dignity of a man who had waited half a lifetime for this moment. I may have pushed a mop, he said, his voice low but ringing with finality, but today I push you out. Ryan was escorted from the room, his protests echoing down the hall. In the silence that followed, every eye turned to Otis Carter, the man they had ignored, mocked, dismissed, the man whose silence had been their shield and whose voice had now become their reckoning. And for the first time in the company's history, Sterling Corp's boardroom belonged not to the heirs of privilege, but to the janitor who had always owned it. The boardroom door had hardly clicked shut behind Ryan Sterling before the reality of what had just happened began to ripple through the glass tower of Sterling Corp like a shockwave. Outside the paneled walls, whispers spread from desk to desk, elevator to elevator. The janitor walked into the board meeting. The janitor owns the company. The story was too impossible not to be repeated, and too electrifying not to be believed. Inside, the remaining board members sat frozen, their faces pale, as if they had witnessed not just a corporate coup but an exorcism. Martha Donovan was the first to break the silence, setting her papers aside with deliberate care. Well, she said, her voice quiet but firm, it seems we have a new course to chart. Mr. Carter, as majority shareholder, the board will look to you for direction. For decades, Otis had been invisible in this very room, his mop bucket left outside the door while decisions were made over people like him. Now every eye, every desperate gaze turned toward him. He could feel the weight of it pressing down, but it did not buckle him. He had carried heavier burdens in silence for half a lifetime. We start, Otis said evenly, by canceling every planned layoff. 400 families will not be destroyed to protect executive bonuses. We start by opening the books and letting the light in. And we start, his gaze swept the table, stopping at each face, by remembering this company was built on people, not just profit margins. The words landed heavy. Some nodded, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared challenge him. By the next morning, the impossible had gone public. Headlines screamed from every financial outlet. Janitor CEO, Sterling Corp shaken by boardroom upheaval. Secret shareholder revealed, Otis Carter, custodian of power. Camera crews camped outside the building. Employees, long used to passing Otis without a second glance, now stopped mid-stride to watch him enter in a modest but dignified suit. Their eyes followed him with awe, confusion, and a kind of reverence. For the first time, they saw him. At 10 o'clock a.m., every employee was summoned to the company auditorium. The space overflowed. People lined the walls, perched on steps, craned their necks from the hallways just to hear. The air buzzed with nervous chatter. Was this real? Was the janitor really in charge? Could he save their jobs? When Otis walked onto the stage, the room fell into an uncanny silence. He paused at the podium, his weathered hands gripping the edges. His voice, when it came, was calm but carried the weight of decades. My name is Otis Carter. Many of you know me only as the man who swept your halls, emptied your trash, and polished your desks. That was true, yes. But what you never knew was that I have also been the silent owner of Sterling Corp for 35 years. I chose invisibility because your founder, Thomas Sterling, and I agreed the world was not ready to see me as his partner. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Otis let them settle before continuing. But the time for silence has ended. Yesterday I heard discussions in that boardroom about cutting hundreds of jobs held by people like you, people who have given their lives to this company. I could not and would not remain invisible while livelihoods were treated as numbers on a page. He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd, locking on faces in every corner. I know what it feels like to be dismissed. I know what it feels like to be underestimated. And I know what it feels like to wonder if the next paycheck will come. That ends now. Sterling Corp will not be built on exploitation. It will be built on dignity, on innovation, on integrity. The applause began tentatively, then grew, wave after wave, until it thundered through the hall. Maintenance staff stood with tears streaming. Young interns clapped furiously. Middle managers, uncertain at first, found themselves caught in the rising swell of relief and hope. But not everyone applauded. Logan Matthews stood stone-faced at the side, his phone already in hand, texting furiously. And though Ryan Sterling had been escorted out the day before, his shadow still lingered. his allies, his contacts, his appetite for revenge. Later that afternoon, as Otis met with auditors and counsel to formalize his role, a television in the lobby flickered with breaking news. Ryan Sterling, flanked by lawyers, addressed the press outside his penthouse. His voice was defiant, his smile brittle. "This so-called takeover is nothing more than fraud," Ryan declared. "My father's company has been hijacked by a man with a mop and a fabricated story. We will challenge this in court. Sterling Corp will be mine again." Employees gathered around the screen, their faces tight with unease. The man who had ruled them for years was not finished. Back in the executive suite, Otis closed his office door and stood before the window. The city spread before him in a glittering sprawl. For the first time in his life, he was no longer watching from the shadows. But he knew Ryan was right about one thing: the fight was not over. Ryan had money, lawyers, and allies who resented the new order. Otis had truth, documents, and the loyalty of workers who had finally been seen. The war for Sterling Corp had only begun, and as the cameras rolled and the world watched, one thing was certain: the janitor who chose to clean was now prepared to cleanse far more than floors.